Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm Susan Call. I'm the events advisor here at Politics and Prose, and on behalf of our owners and our entire staff, it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening. And it's also good to see everyone back after the holidays. We have great events and classes and trips in this new year, so be sure to take a look at our website. We also have some calendars up at the information desk. And before we get started, a few familiar housekeeping items. This would be a good time to silence your cell phones. Also, after the event, if you don't mind helping us by folding your chairs and leaning them against something, that would be helpful. During our Q&A, we have a microphone right here. If you could line up with your questions, because we are recording this event. Or if you can't get to the mic, just raise your hand and we'll repeat the question for you. And we're going to have a signing after the event right here. So before I tell you more about tonight's author, I want to first thank Moment Magazine for being our partner on this event. If you're not familiar with Moment, Moment is a distinguished magazine of politics, religion, and culture through a Jewish prism that was co-founded by Elie Wiesel. And we have the magazine here at the bookstore, so you might want to pick up a copy. And now to Lauren Grodstein's new novel, We Must Not Think of Ourselves, which was inspired by an underground group in the Warsaw Ghetto during World War II that took testimony and maintained an archive of its occupants. The book has been described as a masterpiece and is receiving all manner of deserved acclaim. It was selected as a Today Show read with Jenna, and the New York Times called this a tender, heartbreaking novel that grapples with timeless questions. It was also selected by the Washington Post as a noteworthy book, calling it a gripping historical novel. Grodstein is the author of Our Short History, The Explanation for Everything, and A Friend of the Family, among other works. Her stories, essays, and articles have appeared in various literary magazines and anthologies, and have been translated into French, German, Chinese, and Italian, among other languages. Her work has also appeared in Elle, the New York Times, Refinery 29, and a host of other places. And she's a professor of English at Rutgers, where she teaches in the MFA program. Grodstein will be in conversation with Amy Schwartz. Amy is Moment Magazine's opinion and book editor, as well as the editor of the magazine's popular Ask the Rabbis section. She was a longtime editorial writer and op-ed columnist at the Washington Post, and she's also worked at Harper's, the New Republic, and the Wilson Quarterly. She's the president of the Non-Denominational Jewish Study Center in Washington and speaks and runs workshops on topics of Jewish commentary, Psalms, and literature nationwide. So please help me welcome Lauren Grodstein and Amy Schwartz.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out. And Lauren, I'm so excited to meet you and to talk about this wonderful book.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for that warm introduction. And, you know, Politics and Prose is known as sort of the bookstore in D.C. to come to. And for every book that I've published, I've always wanted to be able to come read here. So it's a joy and a delight to be able to actually do so. And thank you guys so much for coming tonight.
Yes, and I should have also thanked Susan for the lovely introduction. Sorry. So I wanted to start, if you'll forgive me, I want to start by asking kind of a meta question.
Sure.
This book, this novel, as Susan mentioned, is about the Ringelblum archive. This a famous story, but not maybe not as well known as it should be, about this heroic group of people who kept a detailed record of life in the Warsaw Ghetto as it was ending, and buried the records in a milk can, that was then found after the war. So, this is an incredible story, and we'll talk more about that. But on top of it, you're a very accomplished novelist. This is not your first rodeo, and you've layered on top of it this I won't say a regular story, but like a recognizable novel with a beginning and a middle and an end, and characters you care about, and suspense as to what's going to happen to them. So I wanted to ask you, just to start, how do you go about telling a story like this that's part of this such a larger story, this large story about the Holocaust? How do you get into it?
So I'm always interested in like kitchen tables and in interpersonal relationships, the stuff that parents talk about with their kids, the stuff that husbands and wives argue about after the kids are asleep. Like I am not equipped in any way to make grand pronouncements, nor would I want to be, about major world events. What I am interested in is being a person, as I am, as you are, as we all are, caught up in the major world events trying to live our lives. That is what interests me. Never in a million years would I have wanted to, nor did I try to write a Holocaust book in a way that is going to say anything about the Holocaust. Particularly, what I wanted to do and what I tried to do was write a novel about people who were doing the best they could with the information they had and the limitations they had and the resources they had, stuck in an unbearable spot. The fact that it reads like a novel about normal people is because it is. One of the things that I've often thought about when I've thought about the Holocaust is how the 6 million Jews who were killed in so many ways were reduced to how they were killed. That becomes their entire life, was the manner of their death. They became the 6 million. But actually, each one of those 6 million was a person with hobbies and interests and good habits and bad ones, with things that they really like to do and things that they probably maybe were embarrassed to be bad at doing. And so I find that those are where the novels lie, right? In those parts about those parts of people, that's what makes me want to write stories and tell stories.
Mm-hmm.
So that's all I ever wanted to do here, was take these the people who did, so many of them ultimately die in the Holocaust, and bring them back to life in their individuality as best I could.
So it's one of the that's a wonderful framework to start with, and one of the things that I found most interesting and most sort of impressive about the book is it is true. These people, they're so normal for so much of it, and they don't understand, they don't believe what's happening to them. If we'd known, he says at one point, your narrator, if we'd known it would be a year, we would never have survived. But since we were certain it would never be a year, we're all still here,
Yeah.
But so, and then you build that so beautifully, and then when something really horrific does happen, which obviously because of the subject matter, at a now and then, something unthinkable happens. So how do you do that? I mean, how do you muster the craft for that? You're talking about ordinary people going through ordinary things, and then bit by bit they're experiencing something that none of us, thank God, will probably ever experience. I mean, what's that like as a writer to get to those scenes?
People have asked if it was depressing to write. Honestly, it was not. It was depressing to read later, but the writing part of it is the job of it, was just the facing the truth. If other people had to live in it, I certainly would have the courage to try to write about it. So the job was, Kate, there's like a C right there. Good. So I really tried not to get particularly overly it's impossible to be. I tried to be as dispassionate as possible in writing the hard stuff. There was no other way to do it. And then when it was over, I would let myself feel things. But I just very much tried to be as much of a camera as I possibly could, and not not a soft animal.
Did you feel like that was probably how people themselves were coping?
Maybe. I think everyone did what they could, and then some people did nothing, and that was an okay response as well. Some people just let themselves feel everything, and some people survived, and some people, and more people did not,
So let's. This is all very abstract. Let's hear
Okay.
a little bit of the book. You've told me that you often find the first 2 pages are a good taste
sure.
of the book. So let's do that.
Okay. I have found, as someone sitting in your chairs very often, that listening to books, listening to the reading is not often as. Anyway, I won't go on too long. How about that? But I'll just read a little bit. 1. The man came to my classroom on December 14th, 1940, at 16 40 hours. I wrote down the time and date immediately because he asked me to write down everything immediately, and there was no reason not to comply. All the details, he said, even if they seem insignificant. I don't want you to decide what's significant. I want you to record. You are a camera and a dictaphone, both. He was tall with brown curly hair that seemed clean, newly cut. He had heavy brows, hooded eyes, and a sharp nose, and all in all was handsome in a rather somber way. He spoke educated Polish with an Eastern accent. His name was Emanuel Ringelblum. I've heard of you, I said. He was the one who was organizing relief agencies, soup kitchens. He smiled briefly, and his face briefly warmed. I've heard of you, too. You were a teacher of foreign languages at Centralny. Now you're teaching English here. That's right. He put a hand in his pocket, took a glance around my meager classroom. I have an archival project I'd like you to be part of if you're interested. He paused as if to consider his words. It's important work. I've asked several people I know, professors, writers, to take notes on what they witnessed during their time here, to write everything down, everything that's happened from the time we wake up to when we go to sleep. And we do this why? I asked. Very few of us here needed more to do. It is up to us to write our own history, he said. Deny the Germans the last word. A dry chuckle escaped me. It's hard to deny the Germans anything, Pan Ringelblum. Perhaps, he said, or perhaps after the war, we can tell the world the truth about what happened. It was quite cold in the basement. In the few weeks I'd been teaching, I had twice ended class early for cold. Ringelblum didn't seem to notice. Our task is to pay attention, he continued, to listen to the stories. We want all political backgrounds, all religious attitudes, the illiterate and the elite, even every ideology, interview everyone, learn about their lives. I need the best minds here to help. He paused as if trying to decide whether to add something. Will you join us? I was flattered. I will. I'm glad, he said, and reached into his bag to hand me a small white notebook. Write about what it's like to teach here, your students, their parents, their friends, whatever you observe, he said. There's no privacy here. Of course, I knew that. Ask them questions about how they lived before this. Write down what they remember and your own life, with your family before they left, with your wife while she was still alive, your day-to-day activities in and out of the classroom. I can offer you a small stipend. I'm not sure how long I'll be able to do that, however. I wanted to know how he knew about me, how he knew who I was and what I did, but he didn't really invite questions. He had that authority about him. If they find the notebook, you could be killed, he said. They won't find it. He nodded, told me we would meet on Saturdays at the library at 35 Tlemaskia Street. You're not religious, are you? Before all this, I had barely remembered I was a Jew. I told him as much. Well, they won't let you forget now, he said. Surely not, I said. Our group is called Oneg Shabbat, he said, the joy of the Sabbath. Yes, I'm familiar with the term. He left the room a few minutes before 5. I leaned against the overturned barrel, my classroom had no chairs, and wrote down what he'd said, all the details. The perfect Polish, the hooded eyes. I then wrote down a few scraggly details about myself, my name, my height, and what I imagined was my weight, and then immediately scratched out my height and weight, self-conscious. I had never been a diary keeper. I'd never thought myself such an interesting subject. I almost tore the page out and started again, but then I thought, what if someone found my discarded notes? And I also thought, it is not my job to decide what's significant. So I kept going. That's it. So from there, So the man that he's meeting, that he's talking to, is a man named Emanuel Ringelblum. Emanuel Ringelblum is an actual historical figure, someone I had never heard of before I went to Poland in 2019, and I'm happy to tell the story?
Definitely.
Okay, I'll tell the story.
Yeah,
So,
but you want to tell about Ringelblum first, or
sure.
you want to tell?
So I'll tell you about Ringelblum. I'll tell you how I found Ringelblum.
You do it.
Okay. So in 2019, before the pandemic, my little sister, it was her son's bar mitzvah year, and rather than throwing a big party, we went. She took my brother's family, my parents, my family to Poland, where our most of our family was from, in Warsaw and some of the shtetls around there. It was a heavy trip. My kids were like 3 and 11 at the time. They were troopers. We saw all this stuff, and by the end of it, feeling a bit burned by history, 10 of the 14 of us went to see the National Soccer Stadium, which was a great move. But 4 of us, my sister, my parents, and I, went with the tour guide to a place called the Jewish Historical Institute, which is a very anodyne name for a very important place. It's at 35 Tlemaskia Street, next to the Great Synagogue, or where the Great Synagogue was. You can still see the scorch marks. In this part of Warsaw, everything is a few feet above ground because it is all built on where the Warsaw Ghetto was. Before I went on this trip, I was so naive, so underinformed that I actually thought you could still see a little bit of the ghetto. I didn't even understand that it was just entirely destroyed after the uprising in 1943. You walk into the room and you see written on the wall in Yiddish, Polish, and English what we were unable to shout out to the world, and that's an interesting thing. And then you walk up a set of stairs and you see this huge table, and written, sort of inscribed in the table are 32 names. And you can pull out a drawer under each name and you read about these people, and it becomes clear who these people were and what they did, under the direction of Emanuel Ringelblum, who was an historian who had spent some time in Switzerland. He was an educated teacher who found himself in Warsaw when the gates were locked in November 1940. He realized immediately that what was happening in Warsaw, you have to remember that Warsaw was the home of the second biggest urban Jewish population in the world at that time. Poland was not a monolithic white Catholic country then. Poland was quite diverse. Jews made up 25% or so of the Warsaw population, right? So, that's a lot of your neighbors. That's a lot of your friends and your dentist and your kid's teacher and the custodian, like a lot of Jewish people. All of them had been taken with Ringelblum, locked into the historic core of the city, the historic Jewish core, locked in. The Germans said that they were keeping the Polish and German populations of Warsaw free from disease by separating them from the Jews. So Ringelblum looks around and understands that this is a signal moment, not just in the history of the Warsaw Jews, but of all Jews, because the Warsaw Jews make up such a big percentage of all Jews. And we're going to have to write this down starting now. We're going to write it down starting now, everything that happens. And you wouldn't believe the things that happened in this ghetto where the population was given, the Nazis allowed 250 calories a day, right? So that's starvation. People were imprisoned for looking the wrong way, or they were shot on the street for tripping in front of a guard. I mean, among the sort of depredations, there were theater companies, there was a Yiddish Shakespeare company, there were classes. Students liked to go to classes often because you could get breakfast there. There were weddings, there were funerals, there were brisses, there were birthday parties, there were seders. There was Jewish life in the most unthinkable conditions. And Ringelblum had his 32, that we know of, there might have been more, members of this group called Oneg Shabbat, that he did task, gave them white notebooks, and had them write it all down. In 1940, should I keep? Okay,
yeah,
I'll keep
go
it.
on.
So in 1942, something called the Grossaktion started, which was the Great Deportation. The Great Deportation meant that 6,000 people a day, based on lists that the Nazis made up, and nobody understands the logic of who they put on these lists, but 6,000 people a day were deported to Treblinka, where many of them were gassed upon arrival. And that happened in July 1942. That's when the first part of this archive was buried under the ground. The rest of it was buried under the ground in 1943 before the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. Of the 32 members, so in this building, in this archive where I was in 2019, we found the stories. We read about the members of the archive, and then you walk up another set of stairs and you see the newspaper clippings, and you see the diary entries in Polish and in Yiddish. You see the watercolors. There was one woman who makes a little cameo. Lots of the actual archivists sort of make cameos in this book. There was one, a beautiful artist named Gila Sextain, who did all these portraits of her daughter, and my daughter was about the same age as her daughter was, and she said, I just want the world to remember that my daughter lived. And she was this beautiful girl. And so you see those pictures of her, you see the papers right in front of you, and I was just astounded that all of this existed. In 1946 and then again in 1950, the 3 surviving members that we know of the Oneg Shabbat archive showed people where to dig. They dug up 2 of the 3 milk cans that contained most of the material. You can see one of them in Poland. One of them is at the National Holocaust Museum, and you can, and that is why we know what happened in the Warsaw Ghetto. And when I left that building with my sister, after spending many, many hours there, the people at the soccer stadium were out drinking. But we left this building sort of in shock that we had seen so much and we had known none of it. And I said to my sister, there are 1,000 novels in that building. And she said, well, you should write one of them. And I was like, no, I don't think so. Because that seemed incredibly hard, and I like to write novels about middle-aged women going through a rough time. So it did not seem to me that this was my material. You know what I mean? I like books where you can't get your kid into the right preschool. Like, that's my lane. And so this lane seemed like a very different lane and a much harder lane. And I never would have even tried to walk onto the lane until the pandemic started. And suddenly, and this is in no way to compare my very, very, very safe and comfortable pandemic circumstances with those in the book, but sometimes to write a book, you just need a window. Like, you just need to you just need a way to peek out. So suddenly during the pandemic, there are people dying and you don't know why, and you're stuck in a house, and you suddenly hate the people you live with. I love them. They were great. You're living in a new, different way, and it was the window that I needed to just shove open a little bit to try to write this book. And since everyone needed something to do during the pandemic, and my sourdough sucked, I did this. And I tried, you know what I mean? And I really had no idea when I was done with it if it was any good, because usually when I'm writing a book, I have friends that I will give the book to, but back then everyone was like homeschooling their kids. I was not going to hand any of my overburdened, wonderful writer friends like a manuscript that I wasn't even sure about. So I just gave it to my agent, and I was like, I tried this, it's different. And that's what I did. That was a really long answer.
No, that's
to a question. I forgot what the question was.
It's a good story.
That's
the
a
question.
story.
That was the question.
That was the
like,
question.
How did you come to write this novel?
/
about,
who was Ringo Bloom?
And
So
what were you
that's
doing in this lane,
Yeah.
which is, as you probably found out later, is crowded with
Super crowded.
people who are good at it, people who aren't. But a lot of people have tried to write various kinds of Holocaust novels. It's a daunting prospect. So.
Yeah.
And I mean, you say that, and the other window, I think, for a lot of people on these stories from the pandemic was the idea that overnight life could suddenly change.
Correct.
Right? And
Right.
everything you were doing could suddenly be at an end.
Right.
You have to do other things. So
Right.
it's but again, you don't want to you're not comparing. You're just feeling it. So it's interesting. I mean, that excerpt is it explicitly swears off in the excerpt. He sort of explicitly swears off trying to shape the story in any way, but of course, you know how to shape stories. It's a story that you shape. What was it like to write a story where the frame is given like that? Where, I mean, like in a Holocaust related novel, there are sort of beats. Like there's always a point where everyone finds out what's going on in the camps. There's always a point where someone gets shot in front of you. It's like, how do you navigate that as a novelist?
So since this was my first time writing historical fiction, I mean, the first thing I had to do was just get my history right. So I spent a lot of time reading, which is a very enjoyable way to pretend that you're writing when you're not. So I just did a lot of procrastinating, and and then when I felt ready to sort of get into it, like I'd written the first line, which did not end up being the first line of this book, but was it's the first line now of the second chapter, and I wrote that, and I just let it sit there on my computer for a long time. And then when I was like, okay, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna try to do this, I taped a bullet point list of like major events of World War II on my desk so that I could always cross-reference what the people in the ghetto knew versus what was actually happening. One of the things, although I was writing about a very horrible time, in a way I was writing about, for most of the book, I was writing about a better world because it was a world before Auschwitz. It was a world before the death camps. The characters here are constantly stunned at the news that they hear because the news is stunning. If you live in none of us live in a world before the death camps, so it's hard for us, I think, to wrap our heads around what a stunning, monstrous thing that is, and like we just sort of accept that we know that this is part of history and it's horrifying, but it also is just true, and that's what happened, right? But it is remarkable to consider with the eyes of, or the ears or the heart of someone who had never heard of Auschwitz what this means, right?
Right.
And
Imagine hearing that for the first time. Ugh.
Imagine living in a world where this is starting to happen. So that, I think, was that for me was sort of the biggest, that was the hardest part, was just to regain the innocence of someone who lived in the before of that.
So,
Yeah.
so that raises the other sort of obvious related question. You say you went to Poland with your family to sort of look at your roots, and you mention in the afterward that if your great grandparents hadn't left Warsaw 20 years before the war, who knows if you'd even
Right.
be here, right? So, but I'm curious, like, did you grow up with all of this in your head? Did you read a lot of Holocaust books as a kid?
No, there was almost nobody even knew in my family, like, why. Nobody even knew, like, why the family had left, and everyone assumed, like, often Jews left because, like, someone was going to get drafted, or they left because the anti-Semitism had become too. And then we finally found out that my branch of the family left because Uncle Willie killed someone. And so, in order to escape the authority, you can laugh at that. I think it's funny. Like, great Uncle Willie Pasachevsky, either severely maimed and/or killed somebody, and so the family had to, like, get out real fast. So, I'm not condoning this. It's just what happened. So
That's gotta be your next novel. Am I right?
I mean, so anyway, so this was, I don't know, like 100 years ago now, and so anyone who had, like, the way they'd say in my family is like if you they knew that people left, but we only found out quite recently why. Some people stopped in Paris. People with a little bit of extra money got all the way to New York. The ones who stayed in Paris survived the Holocaust by hiding with priests, and I know them. And what's really, really wild is, like, to look at, like, a great aunt. My great aunt Rosa died not too long ago. She looked exactly like my grandmother. I met her in Paris, and it was, like, wild the way that I don't know. But no, I did not grow up in a household with those stories ever being told. When we went back to Warsaw, we were really at the mercy of the tour guide. We didn't, to show us where people might have lived. On my mother's side, someone might have been a fishmonger, and I used that to inspire a story of a fishmonger in here. Mm-hmm. But who knows if that was... I know what being a fishmonger in Warsaw was like, because I did the research in pre-war Warsaw, but I have absolutely no idea if that's what... If even my great-great-grandfather was one, much less if that was what his experience was like. So no, I did not grow up in a family that talked about this stuff ever, that had any real information about where they were from. All we knew was, like, Warsaw, and they left in the early 1920s / late 19-teens.
That might be one reason this book is so good, is because you're coming to it fresh.
Yeah, I think that one of the things I like to do, it's one of the reasons I like to write from a male perspective as well, is, like, I like to be free from my own history and experience. I find that being trapped in myself is not a great way to access imagination. So if I can be someone else as much as possible, that's really helpful.
That's interesting. Well, I was going to ask you about your narrator, who he is a man, but the other thing that's interesting about him to me is what he says in passing, which is that he's a Jew who really never thinks about being a Jew in any way. He's married. Was married to a woman who wasn't Jewish, and he just hasn't lived in this world. Did you do that on purpose because you could relate to it, or just? Well,
I did it on purpose because it makes it a plausible novel. Like, often in novel writing, you really have to make decisions that are so that the novel works. So if this man had been a devout Jew who lived only among other Jews, which is how the majority of Polish Jews were. In Germany, the Jewish community was much more kind of part of the broader society. In Poland, very few Jews were, but Adam was part of the broader Polish society. Because in order for the book to work, and this isn't really a spoiler, he needed if there was going to be any hope for him to get out, he needed resources on the outside. If he didn't have any of those resources, the book he would just be trapped, right? And there'd be no mystery about what would happen next. So you make decisions often based on what the novel needs to proceed, and what this novel needed to proceed was hope or suspense, a reason to turn pages, and the reason to turn pages is maybe he'll escape, and how would he escape? Well, really, plausibly, the only way to escape is to know someone on the outside. What's the best way to know someone on the outside? Is to be connected to them, related to them somehow. There's no devout Jew in Poland in 1920 who would ever marry a Gentile. That was a very narrow subset of Jewish people. It happened, but not frequently. So he had to be one of those few Polish Jews who would have, for the book to work.
Right, but it works also. I mean, he's a very interesting narrator, partly because of that.
Yeah.
So a related question. I'm actually, when I was looking around at the writing about your previous novels online, and I did come across this observation that you're considered very good at doing male characters. So it's interesting that you said that's a preference. But the other thing you seem to do, at least, this is not your only character who's widowed. I mean, one of the interesting things about this character, who not only did he marry a non-Jew, but she died. And the story proceeds partly from that. So, I mean, what's interesting about widowers? I mean, I guess there's two of them in your work.
Yeah. I think that grief is a really important or an interesting social register. I tell my students, I actually have no idea if this is true, but it sounds good. But that short stories especially are always told in the short stories are always an expression of grief. Like whatever else they're about grief. And it's not always grieving a person, grieving a lost time, grieving something that you just missed, grieving. And if you think about a lot of wonderful short stories, they really are often about, if you think of grief broadly, again, not just as missing a human being, but as missing a prior time in your life, missing something that can never be again. There's a Portuguese word that he talks about, saudade, which I'm probably pronouncing completely wrong, but that's a sense of sort of melancholy that I am just drawn to, and I think that there is no writing about the loss of a child is too profound. I can't do that. I don't want to do that. But writing about the loss of a great love to me is just a really interesting emotional register. So I think I've been drawn to writing about people who are in that sort of emotional state. But the reason really, again, that he had to be a widower is for the book to work. Like, you know what I mean? If his wife had still been alive, if he had married a well-connected Catholic woman and this was starting, they would have hightailed it out of there, no book.
He says so. If only if she'd survived, where would I be? I sure wouldn't be here.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So then, I mean, cool, great for him, but bad for me in terms of writing a book.
Right.
You know,
Exactly. So one of the things.
Sorry.
Yeah. No, actually, one of the things that struck me about this book, and I mean this as a compliment. I don't know how it will come across.
Oh, dear.
I'm of the generation that read a lot of a particular kind of Holocaust memoir / novel, and they were sort of Anne Frank novels with happy endings, where you follow the narrator through all these terrible things. They get worse and worse and worse and worse, and their family, they go in the camps or whatever, but eventually they survive, and you understand that the narrator grew up to be the novelist who's writing the book that you're reading, but they're very well shaped. And I mean, the thing about this isn't just a cry of bearing witness. This book's very structured. I mean, it's an actual novel with a plot.
Yeah. I only I prefer to read. I only write books that I would like to read, which seems like that should be obvious, but and I only like to read books that have a plot. I'm really bad. I'm just not. I'm too tired to just read a long list of thoughts. I like, you know what I mean? So like, I just really like books where things happen. So it was very important to me, and it's also a nice puzzle for me when I'm writing. To kind of figure out how are all these pieces going to fit together so that the ending is satisfying.
And also, we know what happened to the Warsaw Ghetto, but we don't know what happens to Adam.
Right.
So the last question, then I'm going to turn this over to you guys, who I'm sure have more interesting questions. So some of the only other works that I'm really familiar with, the other sort of well-known works about the Warsaw Ghetto, we were talking about one earlier, also Rakauer Talks to God, which is this unbelievably dark, grim story written in the 40s in Yiddish, which purports to be the last testimony of the last guy who's dying. He's watching the flames and he's talking to God, and anyway, it's just unbelievably bleak and grim. And this, I wonder if you can, by contrast, if you can sort of, I mean, do you come out of this story with a gleam of hope? Is there anything positive?
Yeah, no, there must be, right? I only write books that I want to read. And I know that there are many, many wonderful books that start at gray and end in black. And that is not a book I want to read. Mm-hmm. So, although, of course, you're writing about the Holocaust, and this is not a book that in any way, this is a hard book, right? It's a hard book to read, and it's a hard book to think about, but there must be light. I think in order to live, you must be able to find light. And when there is no more light, there is no more life. So I chose to always keep, if it wasn't a bright light, there was always at least a candle of light.
So on that beautiful note, thank you so much.
Oh, yeah. You guys have, there's a microphone.
I've been told to urge everyone to come to the mic, and there's one over there.
Yeah, do it. Come on, Kate. All right, there we go.
First one's always the hardest.
Yeah, she's a plant, but.
Okay, number one, you rock.
Thanks.
Number two, one of my favorite moments in the novel is where you have this very, I don't want to make a spoiler, but it's not a major plot point. You have this fully realized, like, chocolate shop.
Yeah.
That's, like, beautifully described and depicted. That's clearly, like, a holdover from the neighborhood before the gates were locked and it became this prison. And it's a wonderful scene. And then as you write it, like, the next day, it has sort of disappeared. Can you talk about that as a literary device? Like, what were you trying to achieve there? Was that like a moment of magical realism, or was that sort of giving us a sense of how fleeting life's pleasures were, or
all of that? Yes, it's true. So there was a confectioner's called Meyerstein's Confectioners. I saw it in a photo. So that's where that scene actually came from. Almost everything in this novel comes from something that was embellished. But even the names of the characters, I never used a full first and last name, but like, there were Adams in the ghetto, and there were Salas in the ghetto, and there were people whose last name was Wiskoff, and people's last names. So, and there was a Meyerstein's Confectionery, and you can see this. And then I just imagined what it was like inside. One of my favorite books when I was a kid was about a magical bakery that disappears. So, you never know what things are going to kind of like filter in. So that idea was sort of there. But also, I think it was. You put it more eloquently than I will, but just that there were, even in moments of great, great distress, fleeting moments of pleasure, but they vanished so quickly. They vanished before you could look at them in your hands. So that's what that scene was. But it was really, I kept referring to the actual source material, and I really wanted to make the ghetto, I wanted to represent what there was in the ghetto, and what there was in the ghetto was this confectioner's. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for this presentation.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about sort of what was found in the milk cartons themselves?
Sure.
And my understanding is there's a third milk
Yes.
can that was never
Correct.
found.
That is supposedly under the Chinese embassy in Warsaw. I don't know for sure. What was found? Okay, so there were 10 aluminum boxes. What was stashed in those boxes was pretty much irretrievable. It was really water damaged. But what was found in the milk cans was just a wild array of they were packing in a hurry. One of the things that was really interesting were the last wills and testaments. I quote one in the very beginning of the book. The one that I quote was from an 18-year-old boy who knew he wasn't going to live. And you can read the last wills and testaments in this archive. And that, I think, I can imagine very clearly these people, often, kids not much older than mine, scribbling out the way they hoped the world would remember them and burying it in these milk cans. And I was saying before that, we were talking before this, that one of the things my characters think, because it's something that I think, it's like I always think, why can't they make the whole plane out of the black box? Like, why it's so nice that they saved the words, but why I wish that they had saved the people. And the characters often thought that as well, because people in the ghetto often thought that as well. However, they did seem to think, they wrote again and again that if we will not live, at least our words will survive us. And I am glad that at least that there's that small measure. It's not compensation for what happened, but it is a small measure of satisfaction of their last wills.
Hi.
Hi.
So I'm not trying to take away from the plot,
Oh,
but
sure.
a lot of the book, there's this, someone wants to be able to get papers to
Yeah.
be able to leave.
Sure.
So here's my question. You get the papers. Let's say someone is able to get the papers. What was the chance that those people that got papers would survive? Or would they be able to get out of Poland? I mean, I was looking about where Warsaw was, and I'm like, the only way you could get really to a safe place would be to get to Sweden.
Right.
So I don't know if your research showed, like,
Very
what happened to those people?
So you can find even now some people whose great-grandfathers, grandparents survived. But if you look at the Oneg Shabbat archive, we know that 3 of the 32 survived. That's a better than average chance. That's 10%ish of the people. I have absolutely no idea how anyone could know this, but they say about 3 to 4% of the people who were in the ghetto at some point lived. How they got through, some people went to Romania. People went, wherever they could. Some people lived underground. People lived in the forests. For every person who survived, there's a different story of survival, but I think the chances were very, very, very low.
But my question is also, like, if you get
if you got
these
those papers, then it increased your chances, I guess. But like at any moment,
right?
you could be caught. It became there when I went to Jewish sleepaway camp and we played this very screwed up game. Looking back, that we can talk about later. But where like we had to be, we were prisoners and we had to get out. And I think it was meant to show us how impossible it would have been to get out of. Again, we were children, and it's very weird that we did this. But the idea was that you could be stopped by a counselor who's playing a guard at any time, and you'd have to make something up or figure something out or act on your wits. And I mean, of the maybe 50 kids who were trying to get out of the rec room or whatever it was, one kid got out.
That's
At
kind
the
of
end.
sick game.
Isn't that really
That
weird?
is really sick.
That's really weird. But
That's
it was
not a good
It was
camp.
the 80s, right? It
It's
was
a
like
different generation
it's
of
the
Jewish
90s,
education.
yeah.
They don't do it that way anymore. But
What was
yeah.
it? Let's call it 1990. It was a different, Clinton.
Wow.
I don't know. It was a weird time. Yeah.
Yeah, that's well, and you drop hints throughout the book when people are dreaming. Like the kids, for instance, they say, "Well, if you could get a train to the coast, if you could cross the Atlantic, So maybe, I mean, it's amazing that anyone got out at all, right? I mean,
Right.
it's
Right. Yeah.
remarkable.
Yeah. And but few people did, and and including a supposedly a distant cousin of mine who got in touch with me after the book, who said, "Did you know your great cousin?" And I had no idea.
No kidding.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Nor do I know if this person's actually related to me, so I don't want to but you get a lot of email once you're on the Today Show. But it's yeah.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah.
Do you know what happened to Ringelblum himself?
He was shot with his family.
In the ghetto? Or?
No. I'm sorry. Yes. After the he escaped before the uprising, or maybe during the uprising. I don't know. And he was put in hiding with many other members of the archive and different escapees from the ghetto, and they were turned over and they were all shot. So he was shot with his wife and his 10-year-old son.
The question was what happened to Ringelblum himself? Wow.
Yeah. I mean.
Yeah.
I don't know how we know that, but it's in the material. Ringelblum. So all the archive, by the way, is online, free. It requires a little bit of clicking. It's not hard to access. If you feel like you need a rabbit hole for a while, you can read some of these stories for quite some time. One of the stories that stuck with me because it reminded me so much. My daughter's 8, and some of you might have 8-year-old kids in your lives. Like, you give my daughter like a dollar, a couple bucks, and send her into Target, and you're there for the rest of the afternoon because she is like looking carefully at every single thing they have and trying to like figure out like, is this how I'm gonna spend my dollar? Is this how I'm gonna spend my dollar? Then she finds out that the thing that she wants costs $50, and then it's a whole headache. But there's a story in the archive of a little girl whose mother gives her a zloty, which is amazing, right? And she takes a zloty to the stores, and she's looking, and she's thinking, and she's holding it. And an archivist is watching all of this. And finally she decides she's going to buy a cream bun at a bakery. And she takes this cream bun, and she's about to eat it, and some hungry boy comes and grabs it and takes it from her. And then a crowd sets upon the hungry boy. And the layers of just horror and sadness and hunger combined with the very real feeling of, I know this kid, you know. And this kid was lucky enough that she had a zloty, which means there's probably another zloty. So she, like, whereas the starving boy needed, anyway, you can spend a long time reading this stuff, which I did. You can also read Ringelblum's actual, it's called Notes from the Warsaw Ghetto. You can read that. You can read the sort of the text of this period is by a guy named Samuel Paskow, called Who Will Write Our History. It was turned into a brief not a brief, but it turned to sort of a fictionalized quasi-documentary film that you can see on
2018, right?
on YouTube. Yeah. So there's lots and lots of material. I think the weird thing about all this is how so many people I know, including well-informed Jewish people, have never heard of this archive before. It's just not one of the reasons that you haven't heard of it is because so much of it was translated, under communism, right? Poland, of course, right? you wind me up and I keep going, so you can just like sort of do that. But like one of the things that was very interesting during the research for this trip is that I got to go to Gdansk, which used to be called Danzig, which was the free city of Danzig, which is where World War II started, where the Germans invaded through, and there's an amazing World War II museum there. And when you go to this World War II museum, you start in 1930. You start with a film strip about World War I, which I found very helpful because I still can't really get my head around World War I. Then you go to 38, 39. You go through all the rooms that represent each year of the war. And by the time you get to 1943, 44, 45, in an American museum, this would be all triumphal, right? You would see ticker tape parades and nurses kissing soldiers, and it would be like, yay, we did it. In Poland, in this museum in Poland, you just walk into a dark room. And on one wall of the room is a quote illuminated from Roosevelt, and I'm going to really botch this quote, but it's something like, "I trust Stalin when he says that he will not oppress the people of Eastern Europe. I believe him. I've looked in his eyes, and I know that he will do what is right." Something like that, and that's it. That's the end of the war. Because what happened to Poland, right, was one catastrophe into another catastrophe, and one of the catastrophes of living in communist Poland was that history was rewritten for you. And so even though the archive had been found, it wasn't like people were very excited to talk about Jewish suffering. You know, in communist Poland, the only people who were allowed to have suffered under the Nazis were the communists. And so a lot of the work that was done, even though communism ended in late 1989 and in that period, I think one of the reasons we don't know about this archive is because of the period where it was found and who it was found by, and the 35 years after it was found, what happened in Poland.
Right, and I think the Poles had it was very hard after '89 for them to relearn history in this, and they maybe aren't quite there. In 2019, when you were there, had the sort of more right-wing government come in already?
Yes.
So you were lucky you got as much of a tour as you did, really.
I don't know. I think one thing that was remarkable to me again and again and again, and I got to go to Poland 3 times, was how, first of all, so many Polish people are discovering the fact that they have Jewish roots. And that happened with so many people that I met. Second, there's a flourishing, I mean, a lot of them are either Russian emigres or people who, did not grow up thinking they're Catholic, but there's like a JCC in Krakow. There's there's a flourishing Jewish resurgence in Poland. So many of the caretakers, I went to cemeteries and museums, and so many of the people that I met were not Jewish, but you walk around Poland and you understand that this is haunted. And you, even if you're not Jewish and you have no Jewish family, you can't walk around Warsaw and not see where the mezuzahs used to be on the walls. You can't not see the Yiddish lettering that's just painted over 50 years later and still there. 80 years later, Poland is haunted by its lost Jews. And so I don't think that any right-wing government can completely erase the fact that they were there. And the history keepers now are rarely Jewish, or they're not Jewish in that they grew up being Jewish. They might have converted, or they might have discovered that they were Jewish, but they are people who are dedicated to the real history of their country, and there are more of them than you would think. Before I left for Poland, people said to me, American Jews said to me, "I could never go there. How could you go there? It's such an anti-Semitic place." Well, you could say the same thing about here, but I found again and again, not just that people were willing or eager to engage with me as a American currency carrying tourist, they were eager to engage with themselves, with the neighbors they had lost, with the history that was still buried under the ground. And I am so, so grateful. Also, they knew more about this stuff than I did. Yes, I will repeat your question.
Yeah. Why don't you go to the mic? We've still got some time.
Yeah.
Just had a quick question. You
Yeah.
said that your daughter's 8 years old. And,
Yeah.
I'm an educator, and I'm
Yeah.
always curious on when's the right time to introduce this topic. And I would imagine I know probably 8 or 9 years old, you probably start talking about it. I know at least in religious school. So I'm just curious when you're writing this.
Yeah.
This
It's interesting.
topic,
So
how
my
do you-
my
yeah.
son, I was in 2nd grade when he brought home a copy of Who Was Anne Frank from Hebrew school, and I was really freaked out because I had not talked to him about this. And they have these little adorable kids biographies, Who Was, Who Is, and so Who Was Anne Frank? And I was like, oh man. So I talked to him in a very casual, general way about this, which was all that he could handle. My daughter, I've not talked to at all about this, even though she's been to these places, but she was there when she was 2 or 3, I guess. we will talk about it when I think she's ready to talk about it, but I remember learning about it and having nightmares. I don't know if it's the right thing to protect her from what the world really is, but I'm going to do it for a little while longer. Yeah.
Can you go to the mic, please?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, two things. Curiously enough, we thought we were German for years and years, and it turns out, no, we're Polish.
Yeah.
After my mother died, I found her the Polish passport that my mother came over to America with. That's
Yeah.
the only way they got out of Germany. But the other thing is, I have lots of cousins in Israel, and when they do their senior high school trips, where do they go? They don't go to America, they don't go to Europe, they go to Poland.
Yeah.
So there is a lot, I think America, we're kind of blind to Jewish Polish history, but that's where they go to see what history was all about, and I find that fascinating.
Yeah. There's a group that takes American teenagers and they actually walk from Poland. It's a March of the Living.
March of the Living.
And a lot of the Polish people I found were very, not offended by that, but felt like life happens the whole time. That saying that life is in Israel and death is in Poland, life is also coming back in Poland. So it was an interesting conversation to have with a lot of Polish people about that.
There's been some diplomatic trouble between Israel and Poland on this very question. Poland doesn't like the March of the Living. They want it to be different. Israel pushes back. They
Right.
say we can tell this story. It's our story.
Right.
That's very interesting. Is this book going to be translated into Polish?
I don't know. I will say that my Polish is very bad, so I will not be doing it. I went to Poland a couple times. I included some Polish in here, and wow, does anyone here speak Polish? Bless you, man. I mean, none of you do, so forget it. But that is something, huh? So, but it is my hope that it will be, yeah.
I thought it was very interesting that you made him into not a translator per se, but a teacher of all these languages.
Yeah.
He's teaching the kids English, but he's going back and forth all the time.
Yeah.
And you even have a part where you talk about he's teaching them a little bit of German,
Yeah.
but he feels bad about it because he doesn't like the idea that there's poetry in German. Were you sort of on purpose referring to there's a big philosophical thing about German?
Yeah,
And
I read that in
know.
graduate school, what the German language is now.
Right,
And that,
right.
yeah, and that's one of those things that just lives inside me. But no, I just thought it was, I just like to give characters like superpowers that I don't have. And if I had one superpower, it would be to be invisible. And if I had another one, it would be to fly. But if I had a third one, it would be to sing really well. But if I had a fourth one, it would be to speak a lot of languages, which I would love to be able to do. I can't, but it would be a great gift.
Also was a very big survival skill, right?
Yeah.
To speak more languages.
Yeah.
Do we have any more questions? No? Yes.
Oh, where will we publish? I think it's on YouTube. It's on YouTube.
Good.
Guys, thank you so much for coming. I'm so grateful.